Hello, welcome to my channel, and right now it's October 31st, which means happy Halloween to all of you people who are celebrating Halloween. I happen not to celebrate Halloween. I don't care that much for Halloween. I think the only part of Halloween that I like is the fact that all the movie networks are uploading so many horror films, and I think that that's the only reason why I get excited on October 31st. Other than that, I think last time I wore a costume was when I was 13 years old, and yeah, I never bothered dressing up since then. But if by all means you are the type who's crazy about Halloween, then enjoy. So it's only fitting that my review is going to be on Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. This is probably one of these novels that often gets assigned as a read in college or university. Basically, practically every undergrad has either read this novel at some point for class or it was brought up in discussions. Now, interesting thing is that although I am an English lit major, none of my professors ever assigned this book to me. Although it has been mentioned in several of my classes, I never actually had to read it for class and I never had to talk about it for class. But it has been on my radar for a while, especially since The Turn of the Screw is kind of one of these novels that often gets an honorary mention in a lot of different lists, like top 50 books you have to read. You'll find probably The Turn of the Screw. So, quite frankly, I had a lot of expectations for this novel because it seems to be so sensational and it seems to receive so much attention that I sort of expected my mind to be blown. It was not really blown, maybe because I'm a bit biased, maybe because I'm familiar with this narrative, and I've read, quite honestly, I don't want to show off or anything, but I've read better gothic novels than The Turn of the Screw. And I mean, just as an example, Jane Eyre is a fantastic gothic novel. It's not even, it's not specifically a gothic novel, but it has so many of the elements. Wuthering Heights, another classic example. Even Northanger Abbey is probably kind of better than The Turn of the Screw, maybe because it's not so ambiguous and maybe because it's not so vague, but anyhow, in case you want to know what Gothic fiction is, Gothic fiction started out with the Castle of Otranto, I believe, and it's been written in the late or mid 18th century. So usually the common trope of a lot of Gothic fiction is a castle or a mansion in a remote place. There's also usually a female protagonist who is quite often is gonna be a virgin. She's gonna be sort of naive in the ways of the world, but that does not make her stupid or gullible in any way. Just because she didn't know a man doesn't mean she doesn't know life, you know what I mean? And she will be usually quite isolated in this big estate, and she will sort of be haunted by a presence. So quite often there's gonna be a ghost or some sort of a monster. Usually it's a ghost, and sometimes these novels will be written in epistolary form. Epistolary form is just basically letters that are written by someone, usually the protagonist, and these letters will be salvaged by the person who starts telling the story. So The Turn of the Screw is exactly that. It's basically a collection of diary entries made by a governess that some guy who had a huge crush on her saved, and on one stormy, well, I don't think it was a stormy night, but one night he gathers this group of friends around him and he decides to tell them this story, and he seems to be very shaken and very upset, and he's like, well, this is based on real events and it's a real thing and it's really unsettling, but I'm about to share this with you because you are my trusted friends. So he starts reading out these diary entries written by the governess. Now, oddly enough, the governess doesn't really have a name. She is a woman of a poor background, coming from a large family, and she accepts the job of a governess because back in the day, if you were a woman, but you were also poor, but you were also educated, probably the only respectful job you could get yourself was being a governess at a large and rich household. And this governess takes upon a governing job at an estate at a very remote place where she is to teach two little kids. Flora, I think she's 7 years old, and there is Miles, her older brother, I'm not sure how old he is, quite honestly. I think he shouldn't be that much older than Flora, but at the same time, he's not like a teenager. I think he's like 10, but I might be a little bit mistaken because a lot of things in this novel are actually very vague. The fact that the governess doesn't have a name. I mean, how many books have you read in your life where you don't even know the name of the protagonist? That's like super weird. So, before we continue into the plot, let me just say that this review, as all of my other reviews, is not going to be spoiler free. And I've given this book 3 out of 5. The reason why I've given it 3 out of 5 was because I expected so much more. I expected to be like freaked out or scared or something. I didn't feel scared or freaked out. It was enjoyable in a way, but I've read books that were way better than this. And just because there was so much hype around the turn of the screw, I had like high expectations and they were not met. But nonetheless, this is a pretty good book and it's short. You can read it. If you're like a fast reader, you can probably read it in one night. And if you don't have any plans for Halloween, you should probably make yourself a cup of tea. Hopefully it's gonna rain where you are, and just read this book during a rainy day or a rainy night on Halloween. Trust me, it's better than any party you'll ever attend. Well, maybe not, but it's gonna be fun anyhow. So, if you plan on reading this book, you can stop watching right now, but if you don't, stick around and let's talk about the turn of the screw. Yay! So as always, I've made a very short list. I didn't have that much time. I'm sorry, I have a life. I have other commitments. So the list is quite short, and the book is quite short, so it evens out. So like I said, this is a gothic novel. And unfortunately, it's not even one of the best ones, but it's still quite a lot of fun. So imagine yourself that you are a woman who is not super experienced in the ways of the world, and you reply to an ad in a newspaper. Like a Kijiji ad, let's say. And you're going to meet this super duper handsome guy, and he says, I want you to be the governess of my nephew and my niece, but I also don't want you to ever bother me with any kind of problems. If there's any behavioral problems, disciplinary problems, health issues, anything like that, don't bother me. If you need money, you can ask for money, but anything else is out of the question. So this guy, this uncle, is definitely not the uncle of the year, because these two poor kids, they're orphans, and basically the only thing that they have is their maids in the estate and now this governess. Okay, whatever, the governess sort of has a crush on this guy because he's so dashing, and she accepts the offer, probably because he's so dashing. And she goes off to this estate, which is called Bly, I believe, and she becomes their governess. So the girl, according to the governess, is really sweet and beautiful. There's something unnatural almost about the beauty of this girl and just how angelic she is. The boy, Miles, after he returns to the estate because he was expelled from school, again under mysterious circumstances, is even more beautiful than his sister. And the reason why he's probably more beautiful than his sister in the eyes of the governess is because he's a boy. And of course, boys back in the day always got the, upper hand. They didn't even have to try. By default, boys were better in terms of everything. These were not super fun times to live in, but hey, that was what was going on. So at first, everything is pretty cool. The kids are really nice to the governess. She likes them. They like her. Honestly, there's nothing to complain about other than the fact that, life at Bly is pretty boring. There's, no one around. There's, just estate, nature and acres and fields and stuff. And it's quite boring, but the governess is pretty cool with that to an extent. She's sort of curious why Miles got expelled, but no one seems to be talking about it. And then one day she sees a ghost. She sees this guy looking at her from the top of a hill. And the governess gets suspicious because he's dressed pretty nice, but he doesn't really look like a gentleman. I mean, okay. And then I think the same evening or the day after, this creepy dude just stares at the governess from the outside. He just stands right in front of the window that looks into one of the rooms, and the governess happens to be in that room, and the dude is just stares at her. And she's freaks out, but at the same time, this governess lady, she's pretty dope. She is quite courageous. So she marches out of the room and she goes to where the creepy dude stood and she looks into the room and she's trying to understand what he was looking at. And she realizes that he was looking for Miles. Now, I have no idea how she comes to these conclusions. Honestly, the governess, she makes a lot of conclusions and a lot of deductions, and she seems to just know things. And even when Miss Gross, who's the head of the estate, asks her, "Are you sure? How do you know?" And the governess just says, "Oh, I know." And we're okay, she knows. Okay, then we'll take her word for it. So the governess then sees another ghost. And the other ghost is the ghost of Miss Giselle, who was the previous governess, who supposedly committed suicide or died under mysterious circumstances or something the like. No one really wants to talk about the previous people who lived at Bly because they all died. I mean, the creepy dude is Mr. Quinn or Mr. Quincy. I'm so sorry I don't remember his name, but it started with a Q. And he was a douche in a way, and one night he got drunk and he was walking downhill and he slipped and he broke his neck and he died. And before that, he seduced Miss Giselle, and he made her lose her virtue, and he would hang out with Miles, according to Miss Gross. Now, this was a very disturbing part for me, because Mr. Quinn or Quincy or whoever he is, he was this drunkard and he would sleep around with women and all that. And I was what does he want with a boy like Miles? It's not like Miles was his age even. But somehow he was influencing Miles and I don't even know why he would want to hang out with a little kid. Just the premise of that sounds very weird. And Miss Gross says that he was very liberal with everyone. And I have no idea if she means that he forgot his rank, because let's face it, society then was heavily based on social standing and social class, and there were things that you were not allowed to do under any circumstances because you belonged to a certain social class. And supposedly this Quincy guy, he like totally like allowed himself to behave as if he was the master of the house, just because like the uncle wasn't there and he couldn't care any like less of what was going on. And I don't know, it was never even clear what was going on at the Bly estate, like honestly. And then he died, and Giselle died, and Giselle ghosts would appear, but Giselle would appear to Flora, because Giselle would hang out with Flora. So I don't really know what they were doing. It just sounds very pedophilic for some reason. It just sounds so wrong on so many levels, but I mean, I have no idea. Maybe relationships between adults and grown-ups were different in the 19th century. I honestly have no idea. I didn't live during the times, so I honestly cannot say. But at some point, the governess, she just seems to know. She just knows. She knows everything without even like knowing the whole story. And she also seems to be the only person who sees the ghost, because Miss Grouse never sees the ghosts. The kids kind of deny that the ghosts are there, even though on several occasions the ghosts manifest themselves when the governess is with the kids. And they're just like, oh, we don't know what this lady's talking about. We haven't seen no ghost. And the governess is like distraught at some point. And she doesn't know if she's going insane or if she's really seeing ghosts. She doesn't know. And at some point, Flora just freaks out on her and says, I don't want to be near this lady anymore because she's crazy. And she just leaves the house with Miss Gross, and the governess stays by herself with Miles. And Miles is being so weird. He's like, he calls her like my darling, and he's acting like he's her boyfriend or something, minus like touching, but he's talking to the governess as if they are super familiar. The way he acts around her is not the way a boy would act. He's acting more like a man would act, and it just reads very weird, and we don't know if like and Miles just goes and says, I've been telling things to boys and that's why I got expelled. And the governess says, what kind of things? And Miles says, I've been telling things to boys, but only to boys that I like, and they told them to other people that they like. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? You need help? So, it's very bizarre. It's a bizarre little book, and I think that the reason, well, eventually, Miles just dies. Just his heart stops beating, and he dies in the arms of the governess. There's like different speculations about this book. Some say like that the governess is crazy, and everything is in her head, and Miles was a little douchebag, and that's why he got expelled from school. Why did he die? Maybe she strangled him, and she was not aware of it. Another version says that the governess is not crazy, and that there are ghosts, and the kids were just incooperative, and they just decided to mess with her and drive her to insanity. Which is plausible, because little kids can be quite awful, to be honest. So we don't know. We don't know why Miles got expelled. We don't know what he told these other kids. I mean, there are like all different kind of websites like Shmoop and SparkNotes, and I'm sure that if you ever had to read this novel, maybe your profs or your teachers had a lot to say. And maybe you had a lot to say when you were reading this novel, and you came to your own conclusion. What I think about this novel? I'm glad that I've read it because it's a classic. I don't really know what to make out of The Turn of the Screw. I know that there's something slightly unsettling about it. Probably because it's so vague and so ambiguous, and there's no answers. and there's like ghosts and people are dying left and right, and the uncle is so weird and he doesn't care, and the governess, she just like, she knows, like, honestly, you like, there's even moments in this novel when she says, but I know, and I mean, I cannot argue with that logic, I guess. Ha! Whew! Well, this is my nutshell review of The Turn of the Screw. I'm sure that there are a lot of fun analysis being made out of this book, because quite honestly, you can read it in a lot of different ways. Some even said that Miles is actually gay, and he's been saying improper things to boys that he liked, and they sort of told it to the principal, and because the principal just felt uncomfortable with that, so they decided to expel Miles. That's like one option. Maybe Miles was just a psychopath. I don't know. Maybe he was like a serial killer in the making. Maybe he just kind of like let Mr. Quincy, Mr. Quinn, whatever, influence him, and like he was behaving the way that he thought that men should be behaving because he had no proper male role model in his life. That's also another option. But at the end of the day, it's pretty sad because these kids are all alone in the world. The only relative that they do have doesn't really care about them. He just wants to live his life, and he thinks that it's enough to just kind of throw money at them, and that supposedly will solve the problem. And the governess does want to help, but it seems like the ghosts of the past are not letting go of poor Flora and Miles. And Flora seems to escape, maybe because she's young and, you know, she got lucky that way. But Miles died, maybe because he is old enough, maybe because I honestly, I don't know. I don't know. It's very hard to analyze this book. I mean, in books like Jane Eyre or Dracula, things were very, very clear and structured. In this one, it seems like it's all down to how you want to read it. And if you want to read the governess as being a crazy lady, then hell, maybe that's like the best way to read this novel. And maybe it will all make sense, because how can she possibly know everything without anyone ever telling her stuff and without her knowing the full history of things? I mean, that just sounds odd. But even though I didn't entirely enjoy The Turn of the Screw, there are quite a lot of films that are sort of based on this, where you have the unreliable, supposedly, narrator, like The Others with Nicole Kidman, where she's kind of seen things and kind of doesn't, and you don't really know if she's being crazy or if there really is something in the house. And like, there's tons of examples. I think any like Del Toro film you're gonna watch is gonna probably make you wonder if the narrator is actually mentally unstable or if there is something going on. If, like, by some sort of trauma, the person has lost touch with reality, or if they are surrounded by ghosts and the supernatural. And at the end of the day, especially if it's a book, it kind of all comes down to the way we want to see things and sort of how we want to interpret it. I would like to think that there were ghosts because I love horror. So, I mean, I'm not sure the governess will have good references after this, and I'm not sure how easy it was for her to get a job as a governess once again, after Miles died in her arms. But, I mean, who knows? Well, thank you for sticking around and listening to me talk about The Turn of the Screw. If you've read it, or you want to read it, or if you have any clever thoughts and you want to share them, you're more than welcome to do that in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this, and happy Halloween! Ciao!